Wabarakatuh. Very good evening. Thank you, Imam. My fellow director, Dr. Safri, my brother Ridwan from Parliament Beliau, and of course our distinguished guest, none other than Imam Khalid Latif. I'd like to begin tonight by thanking our audience tonight, those who have heard Imam Latif speak before, those who have not, those who just came from work, those who are students and willing to learn more. And this event, this topic, this discussion begins with you, and it is carried by you. And I thank you for all of that. Imam Latif, coming all the way from New York City. Imam, or brother Khalid, I hope you had a wonderful flight getting here. Long haul flight. If you have time later, I'll be more than happy to recommend to you some great spots to eat around. I can promise you that the halal guys on 53rd Street will be a distant memory once you have tasted our traditional dishes. Imam Latif has done an outstanding job organizing and leading the Muslim students in New York and in America. At a time when Americans are facing chronic street shootings and death, and a domestic and foreign threat of extremism, Imam Khalid Latif has become a standout voice for Muslims and non-Muslims, a sense of humanity moving forward. Brothers and sisters, we have come here today to discuss a rather serious issue: confronting youth radicalization. It is a prevalent and very relevant issue to our country, our region, and world. Thankfully, however, I believe that the question of Daesh can be confronted simply by what we have done here tonight, by coming together peacefully from all the races, by inviting all sorts of thinkers, and by discussing. The very fact that such a diverse crowd can come together and listen to an Imam from New York is itself a testament to Daesh's weakness. As much as they wish us to turn on one another, we stay adamant and united. I wouldn't want to further the opening remark, but allow me to now invite our distinguished guest, none other than Imam Khalid Latif, to start this lecture. Imam, is yours. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi. Bismillah. So, to give you all some insight in terms of how I would hope to approach this discussion around radicalization, I think necessitates understanding a little bit more about what it is that I do in New York City, in a professional capacity in the community that I serve, and how that's relevant in answering some of the questions that we're hoping to engage in a discussion on today. I serve as the university chaplain at NYU. I share the title there with the rabbi. We have a very robust spiritual life center that has many different faiths, religions, spiritual systems represented in the form of authoritative figures, chaplains. I'm also the director of NYU's Islamic Center. We have about 3,000 Muslim students at New York University. They come from all walks of life, very diverse, different parts of the United States, different parts of the world. Some of you in this room were students at NYU at one point in your life. So even from all the way in Malaysia, we're getting students. We also have many people who just live and work in the surrounding area of our center, who are professionals, family members, who come to our services and programs. And we have a lot of people who aren't even Muslim. They're just engaged in interacting with us in terms of our more social services, community services, but also our religious events. It's not a very insularized community. It's one that engages very diverse populations. With the young people that I see, for a lot of them, their challenge is just trying to figure out how to find a space to fit in. And what's important to premise this conversation off of is that the frame that I'll introduce it in is not an absolute frame. It's not the only frame, but probably a frame that I feel comfortable speaking to given the work that I do. And as a disclaimer, that's probably something that you want to understand in terms of really being able to take on some of these challenges, where we find ourselves engaging in a lot of empty rhetoric and discourse because those who are not qualified to speak on certain topics get up and start talking about them. Individuals who might have some type of tangential degree, they might be able to speak a certain language, speaking to mass populations that are impacting policy that then engage minority populations that lend towards more alienization and marginalization. So many of the young people that I see, they just don't know where to fit in or belong. They're straddling multiple spheres of their identity. Their end result is not necessarily lending towards radicalization. So putting that to the side, but more so for them trying to figure out who it is that they actually are and where that is a challenge, especially for those of them who are trying to figure out the frame of their religion. In the States, there's not so many religious figures or institutions that are built as spaces where you can just go and talk to somebody. And much of that is tied to communities being highly ethnocentric, adhering to a more culturally hegemonic attitude towards religion, people literally not being able to speak the language of the young person who's coming in. You then have community apparatus that doesn't necessarily engage the entire community. Mosques are replications of what they would find in their countries back home. Many of them don't allow for women to come in, and this presents a different frame of challenge. And we can get into it in a little bit more depth, but the sense is that people are straddling multiple spheres of their identity. They don't know how to fit into an American society. Religion doesn't make sense. The people in both spaces tell them where it is that they're lacking or inadequate, and alienization and marginalization just kind of run rampant. For most of these people, they just carry a lot of pain inside. They just don't know where it is that they go. Do you understand the point that I'm trying to say? I'll give you an example to illustrate it. My brother and I, when I was about 12 years old, went to visit my grandmother in Pakistan. My family is Kashmiri. My father grew up in Lahore in Pakistan after the partition. And then he immigrated to the United States as a doctor. He's a cardiologist by profession. My mother manages his practice. And so when I was 12, we went to visit my grandmother after my grandfather passed away in Pakistan. And when I'm walking through the streets of Pakistan at 12 years of age, I don't really look the way that I look right now. I didn't have a beard. Most 12-year-olds don't have beards. Unless you're South Asian. Some South Asians who are 12 have beards. I had very long, kind of Pantene Pro V flowing hair. I was wearing a baseball hat backwards, Timberland boots, baggy jeans. As we're walking down the street, there's this 4-year-old boy, Pakistani, wearing a green-colored shalwar kameez, staring at me quite intently. As I get really close to him, it's just inevitable something's about to happen. And finally, he kind of cranes his head backwards and screams to anyone and everyone who can hear him in Urdu, "Ke Michael Jackson aa gaya," that Michael Jackson is here.
And then he and his friends literally chased me up and down the street because they thought I was Michael Jackson. I'm not Michael Jackson. Just can't tell. In retrospect, aside from the humor, I didn't really fit in there. The place where my parents were from, or my grandparents lived, was not a place that I felt distant from, but I didn't belong in the sense that those who were of that place actually felt belonging. Now the challenge for me was, if I didn't fit in there, but in the country that I was growing up in and trying to figure out where I belong also made me feel as if I didn't fit in, where was I supposed to really go? And for many who are young Muslims, the challenge that they find themselves in is such that the alternatives to them are not very empowering. When they're looking for someone to speak to, space that speaks to their reality, ideas that are engaging, critically intellectual, something that doesn't make God feel like an angry old man in the sky who's looking for a reason to punish you and send you to hell, but evokes not just through rhetoric, but an actual ambience, a God who is the most merciful of those who show mercy, a source of unconditional love, the source of peace, as was invoked in the prayer that we started with, Ya Salam. But walking into many masjids in the United States, you're met with not real understanding, or you're not even given an access point, so to speak. And so when you start to now try to engage a sense of just who it is that I am, the religion in and of itself seems to be one that isn't so tangible. You don't know how to fit in. And then when you don't have many spaces to turn to just to talk about what life is like, to try to really figure out, well, who am I and where do I belong? Everything just becomes internalized. And you become vulnerable in certain ways that are not really so empowering, but aside from being empowering, they just don't feel good. I'll tell you a story of a young woman who came to see me. She went to an Islamic school, went with Muslim students, Muslim teachers. She was born with a facial disfigurement. As a young person, she said that my classmates would constantly make fun of the way that I look. Sometimes I would overhear my teachers and they would be laughing behind my back, thinking I couldn't hear what they had to say. And she said at home the reality was such that my parents didn't really invoke a lot of compassion and mercy and love. They weren't the type of parents to tell us that they were proud of us, but more so where we were lacking or how we didn't fit into their understanding of what good children were supposed to be. The local mosque wasn't one that was really so open to women, and a lot of the rhetoric that came off of the pulpit was, again, not so empowering, but was just about what you could assume it would be about. And she said when I was old enough, I decided to get a surgery done to fix my facial disfigurement. She said my father, he told me that I shouldn't do it. That I would never be beautiful, I would always be an ugly person. And that if I didn't listen to him, God would be angry with him. Or with her, rather, with me, and would punish me. You see how God gets interjected into the conversation. And so she said, I decided to have the surgery anyway. And when I was going through the first rounds of it, there were some complications, and they couldn't resuscitate me for some time. And when they were finally able to resuscitate me, alhamdulillah, she said, rather than being met with any warmth or any real comfort, my father's first thing to me was, see, I told you God would punish you. She said, I decided to go through the second round of operations. She said, for the first time, I enjoyed looking at myself in the mirror. The smile that I saw when I smiled at myself was something that was just so enriching. She said, but it lasted just for moments. My parents would say, you're not beautiful. You have nothing to smile about. The harshness, she said, just hit me so hard at that point. She said, I realized truly just how alone I was. That when I was in that hospital, nobody from my university came to see me. My parents didn't really come to see me as well. And she said, for the first time I actually felt love because my doctors and nurses and the residents and attendants showed me some warmth. They actually made me feel as if I could belong somewhere. So she said, I took a metal can and I started to hit my face with it. And she said, I hit myself so hard that I actually went unconscious. And when I woke up in the hospital, I was dismayed because the doctor told me I hadn't broken anything. I was able to go back home. She said, now I'm just waiting for my life to finish. Because in my religious understanding, I can't take my own life. Now I want you to think for a minute. Where do you think that girl's life would have ended up if she didn't have a space to walk into to talk about what she was going through? If there wasn't an office that she could turn towards where she could just let it all out, a space that helped her to understand religion in a different capacity, but also to understand that her heart was so important that even where nobody else cared for her, there were still people who cared for her. You have to divide this issue because it's not just about how do we go reactively to deal with this demographic that is inclined towards radicalization, because the gross majority of people who feel alienated and marginalized actually don't go into that nonsense. They just carry pain inside themselves. And what we set up for them in terms of apparatus is not sufficient. What we give to them in terms of alternatives don't make any sense. The rhetoric is just, have more trust in God, this is a test from God, put your faith in God. Like, what are you talking about? When I walk into your space, how do I feel like real love and compassion? How does my remembrance of the divine be something that doesn't have to be rhetorically invoked, but it's just felt in the ambiance and the vibe? And more so, how do I find realities that tell me I'm not good enough or I don't fit in and I don't belong? Now when you get to a place, and again, this is grossly simplistic, that you have those people who turn towards that rhetoric, they're finding not just contentment or a sense of self-recognition or value through it, but they find a place to fit in and belong. And our understanding can be, how do we dismantle the notions and ideas that come from the extremist viewpoint? Or how do we take a stance that says that my existence won't be in reaction to idiots like that? And I start to look at the own processes that I'm engaging in and think proactively, not just how do I keep people away from things that are bad, but how do I draw them to the best of themselves and give them a sense of strength so that they can be the catalyst of just bringing benefit to this society. And that's what we do at our center. People say to me, what do you do to combat radicalization? And I say that I'm bigger than the boxes that this world tries to put me in. My engagement is not just to engage in empty discourse and rhetoric, because the world believes that the only thing that Muslims have anything to offer insight on is terrorism and violence. But Muslims have abundance of degrees and credentials, access to a lot of resource and wealth. They have know-how, they have skills, they can go out and build in certain ways. And if the only way that we tap into these conversations is by being reactive to that type of discourse, then we're also just directly empowering the extremist voice, because our existence is only in reaction to them. But I would rather take young people and old people and have them think about their Islam in an empowering way. That says, how is your being Muslim not something that's just good for you, but how is your being Muslim something that's good for the people around you? It necessitates from the starting point just giving people an opportunity to understand God in a different frame, religion in a different frame, and living faith for them so that they can understand that they can be bigger than the worst of their actions. they fall down, it's okay. There'll be somebody there to help them get back up. They don't have to do it on their own. The challenge, if we shift gears, is that what we give in terms of alternatives is not done as well as what those who are drawing people into this type of lifestyle are doing. I've said it in a couple of spaces that I've been in here while I've been in Malaysia, but you gotta understand it as a reality that can be applicable in multiple spheres. Organized evil will always triumph over disorganized righteousness. This is a truth that you have to embrace. And these people are putting out quality content, and that's not me praising them. But when you understand what you find through YouTube, through social media, they're putting the best of their talents into engaging in a professional pursuit of taking people's hearts towards them. And we don't even let women go to Jummah prayers. And it's important to understand the relationship between the two. Because you're indirectly teaching both men and women something about Islam when you do that. When you have individuals who are going to be engaged in literally what is just a different aspect of my interpretation, visualized pornography, but their sensations are just being fed in every single way through this rhetoric that now says those people are pushing you out, they're marginalizing you, they're disenfranchising you. Here's where you'll find a sense of value and belonging. That world only identifies you by the worst of their actions. I mean, really think about it, right? Even in the States, the guys who go into this, which are very few in number in the United States. But I've been in the UK, and literally, like, I've been on the street, and people are passing out flyers to join ISIS. I've been to the Maldives, and for some reason, they had me sit down with these 12 guys who tried to blow up the Capitol at one point. And as I'm engaging in conversation with them, I'm thinking the whole time, these guys use the same text that I use to preach peace to justify violence. It's a reality. But if they can take people who believe that their actions are somehow the only identifiable factor that Muslims will understand them by, those who drink alcohol, they go to the nightclubs, our rhetoric is, they're not so religious. Then these people who embody an understanding of religion are telling them that despite what you do that's not good, you can still find a place here. You got to combat it with notions that understand that if that works, then you got to implement it here. The legalistic framework by which we engage Islam, that's just do's and don'ts and rights and wrongs, that does nothing but elevate us by denigrating others because we turn it into either or as opposed to a both and, that understands ritual not as an end but a means to something, that helps people understand in addition to that or in conjunction with that ideas of values that are excellence, patience, truth, integrity, love, compassion. When someone taught you how to pray, did they teach you who it was you were praying to? Think about it for yourself. When someone taught you how to fast, did they say this is for whose sake you're fasting for? When they teach you to give charity, perform the pilgrimage, the mechanics in and of itself serve as a mechanism for real spiritual upliftment, but only if they're allowed to be introduced in that way. And when they're not, and they're used as a weapon by which we gauge whether someone is good or not, you just add to the feeling of marginalization. So we start to be the reason that people will actually have hope, and not the reason that people need to be in a place of dread, where we suddenly don't fit into what the expectation is to be good, and we're not drawn towards certain realities. The other thing that I would say quite objectively And I'm saying this to you as somebody who recognizes and understands that there are people who engage in these acts of violence. That a lot of the world's governmental apparatus very conveniently is able to call whatever they want terrorism when it doesn't agree with what it is that they're trying to push. Systematic inequity, structural racisms exist in abundance in the country that I live in. And we see that there's a lot of oppression and a lot of injustice in much of the world. And where individuals don't have access to basic needs, basic necessities, they're held down. And the validation of oppression that comes from governmental apparatus is done so under the guise of telling a world that's ignorant of what's happening on the ground that those people are terrorists or inclined towards terrorism. That's why we have to bomb them. That's why we have to drone them. I mean, you see the kind of people who are running for the presidency of our country, my country. They have no issue in maligning minority populations, including Muslims en masse. And while the circus of the elections are going on in the United States, the media is not reporting that America just killed 100 Syrians in a drone attack who are innocent, who had nothing to do with anything. And now you think about that person who's on the ground down there, they're trying to mobilize and get people behind them. And they're going to say that bomb that killed your mother, that killed your child, that the world didn't even care about, the news didn't even report on. That came from an American place, which is true. Because Muslims in the United States are in a place where we're institutionally quite young. And you see the reality of power and clout that's there, that is not in the favor of the Muslim community. The implications on this type of discourse is such that it has global impact. Because through the frames of being able to say that we are combating terrorism, really like the foreign policy is what it is. And then you see the type of extremist voices that are not coming from ISIS, but are completely parallel and analogous to ISIS, that is the Republican right in the United States. The us versus them mentality that these people buy into, that says it's us versus the world. They don't have any understanding of us. We have to be able to take them on. They don't have our best interest. You can take Donald Trump and put him in place of one of these fools, and it would be the same kind of conversation. And it's done to validate and justify policy that is domestic, that is quite invasive in terms of law enforcement strategy, as well as foreign policy that is then leveraged by those on the other end of the spectrum to say that look at what they are doing to us, while those people are saying look at what they are doing to us. So as people of good conscience, we have to start breaking down the binary of us versus them that is a uniformity of the external, race, culture, social class, gender, socially constructed values around religion, belief, spirituality, and start to build spaces that can engage in multiple entry points that allow for diverse populations to be fully present. You want to really take on the issues of radicalization, start thinking about the spaces that are here that are just open to all people. Start to think about really where it is that people are marginalized and alienated and how you can play a critical role in remedying some of that. These guys could care less. You see the presidential election for my country. They're just about getting votes. They don't care who it is that they hurt in the process. And if that's where we lend ourselves towards, then you're going to see people who are just going to let themselves be inclined towards the kinds of things that they're inclined towards. And this is what ISIS wants. They want to see this us versus them mentality be pushed by extremists on the other side. They want to see Muslims be mistreated and be the victims of hate crimes. They want people to have disenchantment with the overall establishment. doesn't happen. You have to become a real part of the system. I don't have any idea how politics works in Malaysia. I don't. I've been here for a week. Half of it I've been super jet lagged. The other half of it I haven't slept because my 3.5-year-old daughter sleeps next to me in the bed, and she's always putting her hand in my face and kicking me in my back, and when I wake up she starts smiling as if that's not a big deal. I've slept like nothing since I've been here. So I can't from the outside in say to you that this is what your government, your social services, your NGOs, your nonprofits are in need of. And even if they're great, good things can always be better. But if you want to go into this type of work, you're sitting here in this institution and it's an event that's organized by those who have some aspect of civic engagement as a priority, then you have to make sure that your goal is about the betterment of your society on a whole. Not just selective parts of it. Not just people who are in the elite. Not just people who are in the privileged classes. Because that's what politicians do in my country. And that's why their stances on things just constantly change, because they're just talking to the people who they think are going to vote for them. The influence of wealth and money comes into play. And it has deep impact on how much of the globe functions in terms of its engagement of other things. You know that some of you, if not all of you, are quite worried. You could care less about American politics, but you're worried what will happen if Donald Trump is in charge of the United States. Can you think that that man will have access to America's nuclear codes? But understand that he's just really exemplifying rhetoric that's been there for some time. And I have not been to a country anywhere in the world where there is not some element of issues tied to race, ethnicity, and privilege. And the lifestyles that those who are in the elite of the world's population want to live necessitate a denial of how many of our intrusions are done so that we can really have longevity to that lifestyle. So under the guise of whatever, it's about oil, then it's about oil. It's about resources, then it's about resources. And if it's not about the betterment of an actual population, then it's not about the betterment of an actual population. What I think you can see, and I know I'm talking a lot and I'll stop, is that these young people, what they're given, and again, I'm not praising it, it's just a sense of direction and value. And that doesn't mean that it's a positive value, but they're being given not just ideals and a moral compass by which, as skewed as it is, they're willing to die for. They're also, for many of them, for the first time, being given a purposeful existence that tells them, here are things that I want to live for, that I want to go out and actually do things for. Most young people, they just don't know what it is that they have going on in their lives. When I ask people everywhere in this world, and I sit down and people talk to me about being victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, mental health issues, poverty, homelessness, grief, depression, suicidal ideation, I mean across the board. Anything and everything that you can think somebody has gone through, I can tell you that somebody sat down and talked to me about. I don't like to generalize about people because they all come from very individual and subjective backgrounds. The two questions that I ask people most often that they tell me I don't know as an answer to is one, what are your values? What are the things that really push you and motivate you? Why do you do what you do? You say, I don't know. And then secondly, I ask them, how do you take care of your hearts? That most precious part of you that often gets neglected. They say, I don't know. And the two get tied, because if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, you don't know what it is that really pushes you, you're not conscious of what it is that you're doing. Parts to yourself that are not tangible, they're intangible. Because your pursuit is just about wealth, it's just about money, it's just about food, it's just about sex. Everything is about the physical and the carnal self. That's where these guys move their platforms and campaigns for, on both ends of it. I say this to you again, is that if you have aspiration to be in a place where you will impact legislation and policy, either on the form of you are a lawmaker or you are somebody who challenges those who makes the law, you gotta just really connect to people where they're coming from. And not give a perpetuation to some of the cycles that we see by just understanding people more broadly in terms of stereotypes, many of which are negative. Because it won't allow for you to bring the best of yourself to the conversation, to think out real solutions to some of these kinds of things. If I can be helpful to any of you and what it is that you have going on, please let me know. I know I'm from New York City, which is not anywhere close to here, in 2 hours by plane. But we can take advantage of whatever it is that we have access to in terms of technology. So that as we do this kind of work, we do it in a way that is not limited to just a space here, or me coming from far away and talking to you for 5 minutes, and then that's the end of it. And this is the only time that we're meant to be together. Then I pray, inshallah ta'ala, God willing, God gathers us all together again in the best of places in the world beyond this one. But let me know what it is that I can do for you. If you're ever in New York, it'd be an honor to host you. Trump wins, I wouldn't recommend coming for the next 4 years. I might move to Malaysia. But let's see what it is that we can do together, and how it is that we don't just identify these problems in a way that we talk about it, but now that we're here, we figure out what can we actively do, and we go and get it done. Wallahu ta'ala alam wa billahi tawfiq. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much, Brother Imam Khalid Latif. Ladies and gentlemen, we now proceed to Q&A, which will be moderated by our head of youth parliamentary, Mr. Ridwan Rosli. Jimmy.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Ridwan on behalf of the Youth Parliament and also on behalf of the Academy. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Really appreciate it. I believe everyone have tons of questions and that you want to ask Imam Latif. And tonight, as we promised, we would love to make the event as interactive as possible. Therefore, just a couple of ground rules before we start the Q&A. We'll try to keep the question below a minute. I mean, just keep it simple, straightforward, precise, because it would be lovely if as many people could interact with our speaker today. So, Imam, can we start?
Yep.
With you? All right, yes. Any question from the floor? Please introduce your name first before the question. Thank you.
Hello, Assalamualaikum, I'm Fauzan, and some people here have known me for asking long questions. I was drawn to a phrase by Imam during your talk just now, cultural hegemony. So it's not uncommon to hear about cultural hegemony in Malaysia, where people who don't consider themselves to be deeply religious, even Muslims themselves or people who have just recently converted, they feel alienated in Malaysia. Perhaps can you share with us about your role as a leader and imam in New York on how to make Muslims or even the members of the community feel they belong as a part of the community? Thank you.
No. So in understanding where there's parallels, necessitates understanding also where there's distinctions. I come from a country that is not a Muslim country, and you all are in a country that is, a gross majority Muslim country. And that sets very different standards to a certain extent. Where there's similarity, though, is that we have diverse populations. I've walked through the streets of Kuala Lumpur, and it's very similar in the sense that there's people of all backgrounds that are walking around on the street here, just the way that it is in New York. You could say, well, there's parts of the country that are not so diverse. In the United States, there's parts of the country that are not so diverse. That's why Donald Trump is where he's at. There's a lot of racist white people who really like him. So to be able to understand, how you start to create something necessitates understanding more broadly just how Islam functions on an abstract level, where there's a recognition built into the concept of Sharia, translated quite loosely as a path to water, that you can approach it in multiple ways. And so a person who thinks of just any body of water, from the biggest of oceans to the smallest of raindrops, the access point to it is not just through one singularized pathway, but you can come to it from all angles. And so true Sharia is meant to be accessible in multiple ways. It's a system that necessitates diversity if we're to buy into a truth that Islam proclaims, that it's meant for all people in all places till the end of time. Obligations are quite few and prohibitions are quite few, and there's a lot of gray in the middle that allows for us to adapt to the diversity of people. Now as the world is becoming a much smaller place and diversity starts to interject itself into these spaces and technology allows for ideas from elsewhere to come and resonate within local populations, we start to be able to understand, okay, how do I engage in a way that still allows for Islam to be what it is and lets me come as I am? And so your first step can think about, how do I change the existing apparatus? Which I would say is probably not a good first step. Because you're talking about institutions that have been built and forged within not just years or decades, but centuries of tradition, both religious and cultural. To create something new, and I don't know how it's done here, so I'm saying this objectively because I'm not from here, in the form of a nonprofit, an NGO, a space that meets the needs of what it is that you're looking to actually accomplish, will first necessitate not finding validation only through existing apparatus. I told a group last night that I was with who asked a question similar because they were frustrated at the fact that, gender doesn't necessarily allow for many religious spaces here to have women come in. I'm not going to put a value statement on whether that's good or bad. I'm going to say that that's a reality, and to not look at it through the framework of equity, because when we talk about it only as fairness and unfairness, a lot of times we don't do anything about it. When you say this is what it is, you can now say that, well, how do I not work despite it, but acknowledge it, and then try to understand if I'm capable of changing it in whatever way. Change doesn't have to come in the fact that says everything else just has to be limited or just taken away, but I can create something new without it having to say that that which is not what I fit into is somehow categorically, absolutely terrible and incorrect. My great-great-great-grandfather probably didn't speak English. If he was Muslim, he would need a Muslim space that spoke to his reality as a Kashmiri man. It would be just as problematic to say that he would have to be in a space that was something I felt comfortable in, as it would be for me to say I have to be in a space that he only fits into and belongs. So sometimes it has to be either or, given the diversity. Where we don't find self-esteem and confidence through religion, makes it difficult for us to then think strategically, how do we go build something with an air of patience, that allows for those who are looking for different spaces to fit in to actually fit in. I had some of my former students and community members who had moved a few hours away from our center have dinner with me when I was giving lecture at a university in the town that they were now living in. And they were sitting down and they were saying that these local mosques, they don't let women do anything. They put us in spaces that are in the basements, if anything at all. Converts don't have any room to really participate. It's like they don't think there's anybody other than people from their cultural background. We can't come back to the Islamic Center at NYU because it's too far and it's at such a distance. And we just wish there was some other place for us here that we could go to. And I said, then, well, why don't you just make one? And they said, how can we do that? I said, what do you mean? And then how can we do that turned into a question of, beyond the anger and frustration, can we actually do that? I said, 2 of you have master's degrees. 1 of you is doing a PhD. All of you have great jobs and you're making a lot of money. Why can't you do it? And so they started small. And it wasn't in reaction to what was there. It wasn't to prove that other people were wrong or that other people were terrible, because this is what you think. Intention is important, right? And if you're going to build simply because you want to put somebody in a place and show them how terrible they are, then you're really motivated by bitterness and resentment. That's not going to gain you anything. And so they started small. They had a weekly discussion group at a local cafe where they just got together and they talked about faith and spirituality. They would have prayer services in the backyards of their homes. They would have barbecues and picnics. I mean, a bunch of different things. And it grew from 10 people to 20 to 50 to 60. And then the same mosques that wouldn't let them in earlier were reaching out to them saying that, hey, can you tell us how we can take better care of convicts? Can you tell us what is it really like for women to be excluded, or how can we do a better job of including them? Building legitimacy takes time. And you're challenging not just individual mindsets, but institutionalized mechanisms that exist longer than any of us have been alive in this world. And if you don't think about that objectively and how it is that you can enact real change, all you're going to do is just talk about the same stuff over and over and over. It's going to be a lot of talk, and not doing, because there's no strategy in terms of how things function realistically. And then when you start to think about it in terms of just spaces, I would say that authority becomes really important. You're going to establish authority either through credentials, degrees that you have, right? Why do you go to a doctor? Because they have a medical degree. And when that doctor tells you to take some medicine, you're not going to sit there and be like, oh, I think I should take this other medicine, because you're not a doctor. That's how authority is established in one capacity, and not thinking about it in other than just how you react to authority in your own capacity. There's certain people you don't question because you just know they learned something. Other ways authority is established is through work experience, a track record. You can point back to what it is that you've done, and people will see that you have the ability to actually do certain things. And so it might take time. It's not going to be done overnight. That time might not just be a week or a month, it might take years. But you can influence what is understood to be normative if you actually bring the best of your energies to certain things. You recognize what your vision is, you have a clearly identified mission statement that helps you to articulate that vision, and you have a revenue model that gives you a financial stability and muscle that lets for actual institution to run in a certain capacity. Where you can start is by just really asking people questions, right? I've been in Malaysia for a week. I don't know anything about Malaysians. When I go back to the United States and I speak at things, I can take the route of being like, oh yeah, Malaysians are like this, and Malaysians are like that, and Malaysians are like this. Because I've been here for 5 minutes, I'm suddenly an authority on Malaysia. People work in this way. The question you're asking is a question of hearts. And our assumptions a lot of the times is that what we go through is what everybody's going through. What we haven't seen is then a factor in determining what it is that other people have actually seen themselves. Your best way of knowing how it is that you cater to the needs of diverse populations is actually being with diverse populations. Meeting them where they're at. Understanding their narratives and their stories. If you build on an institutional level, let needs assessment be something that you actively do. So that you just don't think that, oh, I know everything because I've seen everything. But you talk to the demographic and beneficiary class and hear from them what is it that they really need. So you want to build something for women? Go and talk to women. Even if you're a woman, you're not every woman. You want to do something for converts? Sit down and actually talk to converts. Understand from them what their experiences are like. But I have to admit to myself that I am male, I'm Muslim, I'm American, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a nephew, I'm a husband. That means that I'm not the things that are not those things. And as I start to hear people's narratives now, and I create a confident space for them to just be able to share, I analyze it for trends and themes. So that there's some data to which I can base my programs off of. There's a logic to it that isn't just, I thought, I feel like, I think. But it's actually tied to the people that you're looking to cater to and do something for. You see what I mean? But people are going to be people. And so for them to have the ability to be swayed in a direction that's new is going to necessitate really understanding why it is that they do the things that they do and how you can start to captivate that towards the establishment of your own organizations and institutions. You see what I mean? I talk a lot. I know I do. So you can just tell me if I'm talking too much or it's going too long. And you're lucky because I'm half asleep and this is how much I'm talking. So if I was fully awake, we'd be here for the next 7 or 8 hours.
The next question.
So I realize that madrasas and religious schools across the world, including the ones in Malaysia, sometimes also emphasize on glorifying and also romanticizing our glorious past, the Islamic Empire glorious past. In your opinion, do you think this is a powerful or persuasive authority for the IC recruitment strategy? Because the students, especially in religious schools, keep being reminded about, look, there was once upon a time ago when Islam more than just a way of life, they also rule. So in your opinion, Imam, is this true? Is it a persuasive authority for IC recruitment? And if it is yes, what is our approach to tackle this, in your opinion, of course?
Yeah, I don't know, right? And I'm just going to be honest with you. I'll give you an example of why this would be problematic for me to answer as a question. I'm not evading your question. I went to a masjid in America, and during the Q&A, somebody raised their hand and they said, is it permissible for us to make dua in congregation after a prayer? And I turned around to the guy next to me and I was like, do you all make dua together? You pray together, make a supplication together after the prayer? Or no, the way the question was framed wasn't, is it permissible? It was, isn't it haram to make dua together after a prayer? And so I turned around and I asked, do you all do this here? And someone quite quietly said yes. The Imam of the masjid, who ran the masjid, was like, I do. So I turned back to the person, I was like, look man, I don't know you. But you want me to come into somebody's house and talk poorly about them, when I don't even know what it is they have going on. I can't sit here and make comments that will realistically justify for some of you to believe that the entire madrasa system is problematic. And that's important to understand. I don't know like how it resonates. I teach classes at a university that has a high reputation and caliber, and I know that it's not that simple. Like, the pedagogies can be complex that we implement. I can't tell you that somebody said it for this reason and that's how they took it. What I will tell you is that there are challenges in the existing Islamic educational system globally. And ways that we can deal with that is to ask ourselves why none of us are going into Islam professionally. So I don't know how many of you in this room have seen that there is a gap in the way religious authority functions globally, and then said to yourself, maybe I should go and study Islam. Maybe I need to go into the school and learn about what Islam actually says about certain things. I can make a distinction between who is my teacher and who is my professor. And this is not meant to be platitudinal, but to understand that my access to knowledge in and of itself can be one that once I have it, I can do with it what it is that I want. But if I don't have it, then I can't engage it in any capacity. So if you see a flaw in the current religious system, and you can't open up your own religious institutions because you don't know religion, this is not meant to be self-deprecating nor judgmental, but think about it objectively. Your solutions have to be one that are not just an immediate always, right? This is the challenge that we have as a negative that comes from the way social media and technology allows for everything to be immediate. I need an answer right away. I don't have any patience. I get immediate validation to my thoughts. You gotta build in a way that makes sense and you're strategic. If you all are talented enough and driven enough to spend your nights in an institute that teaches you to be more politically inclined and civically engaged, some of you have to dedicate your time to being able to understand Islam in a frame that is beyond just, I think, I feel. It has to be rooted in a real literacy that equips you with the skills to be able to go out and challenge what is the discourse out there right now. I don't know what it's like to be in Malaysia again. I'm going to keep saying it. But in the country that I come from, people are not encouraged to go into religion. And not because they're adverse to it, but because it's not seen as like a very, prestigious job. It's not something that you can make a lot of money at. It's not something that people will be like, oh wow, like you went to a madrasa, please marry my daughter. But if your primary concern is one that says, well, this is what I need, and then I'm going to think about what's beneficial for everybody, you're letting the cycle perpetuate itself. And that's a question that has to be asked objectively. Why are we not people who go and study Islam? Why are we not people who go into religious line of work? Why do we not become religiously authoritative? And then answer the question. And you don't have to ask it in a big room like this. So you have to give an answer that is really like the facade of an answer because it's the one you're supposed to give, and what will people think? Just ask yourself. Ask yourself what you really know about the Quran. Ask yourself what you really know about Hadith. Ask yourself what you really know about Islamic history, Islamic tradition, and how religion is just religion. And people will use it for whatever it is that they want to. So if you are inclined towards not using it in the way that those who are in classrooms are teaching it, then put yourself in a place where either you learn it and you change what is being taught in classrooms because you're teaching it differently, or you start putting your wealth and resources into empowering individuals who will learn it differently and they will come back and start to teach it differently. Because text is just text. You can turn it into really whatever it is you want.
And this is what most people do these days, right? Our tradition and many other religions have exegetical analysis by which they engage their texts. They read it and they take meaning from it. What most of the world does today, because we have so much access to knowledge and information, is not exegetical, it's eisegetical. We formulate an argument and we cherry pick a verse here, a narration there, and we say this proves what it is that we have to say. You could take the Quran and you could use it in a way that says, this is how I justify female empowerment, and you could take the Quran and you could turn it into a text that says, this is why it's okay for me to beat my wife. It's like you can take the Bible and utilize it to justify a transatlantic slave trade. But you understand how text works. And if your engagement with Islam is just at the level of, this is what everybody's telling me, like, go learn it yourself. And that might necessitate sacrifice. You might not have a life that everybody else has. But if that's what your society needs, then some of you have to do it. And if you're not able to do it, then take the talented and best of your community, another generation, and let them not be worried about what their life will be like if they go and dedicate their time. So when they've studied Islam and they've understood it, you come and you bring them back and you say, wealth won't be a problem. Because we need somebody like you who understands it differently to help us be transformational and revolutionary. These are not words that I know. Maybe I shouldn't say it. But people who can go and really change what is normative. So they don't have to worry about certain things. And that's as a community what we can do, right? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, when he became the first caliph of Islam, the people found him going to the marketplace to sell his goods. He was a businessman, he was a merchant. They said, what are you doing? He said, I gotta make money for my family. He said, you're responsible for the affairs of the entire Muslim community. And so they fixated a salary for him. Because the Prophet Muhammad did not get a salary for being a prophet. And then they found Abu Bakr going back to the market. And they're like, what are you doing now? He said, it's not enough, I need more. He's got kids. He's got a wife. Right? Like people who do this work, you know, I go home, I do my laundry. Right? My wife is an actual person. I have to take her out sightseeing in this country. My daughter is 3.5 years old. When I get home, I can be tired as I want to. I gotta still play with my kids. So your expectation has to be understood in multiple frames and stages. How do we really take on a challenge? How do we really fill a gap? How will we give our wealth? How will we give our time? How will we give our credentials? If I took this brother and I said, you're gonna go study Islam for the next 7 years, right? And I brought him back to the country, what he will need is people who also will help him build an institution, because he studied Islam. He did not study finance. He did not study graphic design. He did not study nonprofit management. He does not know how to do bookkeeping or simple accounting. He did not study mental health. He did not study any of these and an abundance of other fields, which all of you know you can actually build very robust institutions if you tap into the best of your credentials and you say, this is what I am and what I have to offer, and this is what I do not have to offer. Let's go out and actually make it happen. In Pakistan, where I come from, I was born in America, so where my family comes from, there's a huge disdain between the upper class and the religious authority because the madrasas are free. They're free education. So the kids who tend to go to those schools are from the lower social classes, they're poor. I want you to think about this in two frames. One, it creates a problem because those who are upper in terms of their social class start to just hate religion and question everything because they're, why would I listen to these poor people? That's really what it comes down to. But second, what's important, and I don't say this in a judgmental way, but those young kids who come from families where they have many children, because they now have to see children as an asset, not as a liability. The more children I have, the more they'll be able to go right into the workforce, bring additional revenue streams back into the house, because we don't have so much. We need to be able to have all of our families go out and do certain things. Their socialization is such that they are not brought into the best educational institutions, and their critical analysis is not going to be the same as people who go to different schools, many of which you have gone to. That does not serve as a justification for arrogance, but it has to be something that recognizes that then they will be the ones who engage religious text, and they will be the ones who put out the fatwas. They will be the one who will give their opinions and their ideas, because they're a product of the educational system that they are not getting support from, because the rich people think they're stupid, or they're not worth their time, or they're able to go into a discourse that says, look at how terrible they are, because they don't have what we have. And it just keeps the cycle going over and over and over. So take your best and most talented and have them go study religion. The ones who are most exposed to diversity and understand many cultures, give them a salary and a stipend that allows for them to have a role that is much bigger than just, I'm going to lead the prayer 5 times a day. During Ramadan, I'm going to pray Salat al-Tarawih, and that's going to be the extent of what it is that I do in my leadership. You see what I mean, right? There is a tendency for people to romanticize our history. We have a lot of beautiful things that came out of Muslim history, and we have a lot of ugly things that came out. But again, that's because religion is religion. And people have the propensity to be really amazing, and people have the propensity to be like very corrupt and very egocentric. And so their engagement of the faith is going to be based off of what it is that they are bringing to that actual interpretation. It's about what's in their heart. You see what I mean? Right? Go out and build it if it's not there.
Yes. Besides Imam Latif, maybe some of you want to ask Bilal Azwan. Maybe Bilal Azwan also can comment on things.
Assalamualaikum. I'm okay. If someone asks you, especially the non-Muslim, about jihad, how do you define them in the easiest way?
A lot of people don't ask me those questions. I think there's a tendency to think about it in 2 frames. But the challenge is that in the United States, a lot of the narrative around Islam is not owned by Muslims. So the people who are teaching people about Islam are people who have an agenda that don't really want the best interest of Muslims. And they push out a certain discourse that equates a normative understanding of Islam to be understood as being something that's inherently radicalized in its undertones. And so where Muslims are in the States a lot of times is that they're not really being able to define or tell their own stories. We had in the recent presidential election, a lot of Republican candidates call for a test on Muslims to see if they adhere to Sharia or not. And so I had major media outlets from all over the country reach out, and they said, can you give us like a 2-line definition of what Sharia actually is? And so I turned to a lot of people who are in Muslim leadership positions, and I said, hey, this is a great opportunity. Do any of you have working definitions? And the kind of things that I got from people weren't like problematic, but they're sending me like entire essays, they're sending me entire, like articles. They're giving me like long-winded reasons as to why we don't have to, define our religion to like meet the needs of. It's just like, just tell me 2 sentences on the word. It doesn't need all of these things. Our familiarity with our religion needs to be at such a level where those of us who are kind of just practitioners of the faith are able to give those kinds of definitions. What a lot of people in the States do is they'll talk about jihad in the frame of the narrations where the Prophet talks about the greater jihad is the jihad of the self, a struggle against oneself. And that the word jihad in and of itself has nothing to do with what Americans denote it to mean. They translate it a lot as holy war. but the word for war in Arabic is harb, right? It's not jihad. And to give them an understanding of how it's applicable and utilized in the text on a whole, rather than just within that one specific frame that becomes a hot button issue.
Hi, good evening. I'm Ayin. I have a question because I've read a research by a research center, but I don't remember what the research center is about. But it claims that people involved or supporting radicalization or terrorism such as ISIS because they believe as in a romanticizing of Ottoman Empire, which is they believe that we should establish an ultimate leader, such as like Khilafah system. So my question is, what do you think about that? And will you agree that is also a motive people supporting terrorism? That's all.
You know, in Islam you have a recognition that there are multiple forms of governance. So the caliphate system is one form, but it's not the end-all, be-all. Those who might take a more reductive approach to Islam and don't really see a relationship between text and context might espouse it as an opinion or a viewpoint. I think where we have challenges is the prevailing narratives that are around Islam are rooted in many things that have nothing to do with Muslims. And then there are those who turn Islam into a mechanism for just kind of mobilizing people behind their own causes in certain ways. So could that be utilized as a rallying point for people? Yeah, I mean, we see it, right? The Islamic State has turned Baghdadi into kind of this convener, so to speak. But I think what it speaks to is just also an overall crisis of authority that exists in the Muslim world. When you have institutionalized religion or state-sponsored religion, it can become really difficult to separate religion from politics and the objectives of politics. When you don't have institutionalized authority, you know, in my country, because really nobody speaks for Islam in that sense, then everybody speaks for Islam, and essentially then it goes back to the fact that nobody speaks for Islam. And so there's like this challenge because, you know, I've met Pope Francis, for example. We've spoken together, had conversations. The role of a papal figure, to say it objectively, allows for Catholics to know just a clear answer on everything. Because the Pope said it, that's what Catholicism says. It doesn't work that way in Islam. You don't have that structure, especially within Sunni Islam. There's just not that authoritative structure that says this is the end-all, be-all, absolute answers to most questions. And it lends itself towards a lot of frustration. What these guys are able to capitalize on the fact of is that here's a leader that we can all kind of just get behind, who will tell us what to do, who will tell us what not to do, who will tell us what's right, what's wrong, who will legitimize for us in certain ways, you know, what it is that we have going on. I don't have any familiarity or I don't have enough of an expertise to be able to comment on anything that is Ottomanist. I wouldn't be able to sit here and talk to you about Ottoman revivalist movements. I wouldn't be able to sit here and talk to you about how a desire for the caliphate, you know, rooted in that, becomes something that's prevalent within some of the world challenges today. That's just not my expertise, and I wouldn't feel comfortable in sitting here and commenting on it in any capacity. I do think the other challenge that we want to be able to avoid is being able to pigeonhole into a box just one methodological approach to Islam as being the root cause of an actual problem. Because really, there's a lot of complexity that goes into the creation of radicalization and the sustainability of radicalization. So radicalization is not just because of Salafism and Wahhabism. that's like a very simplistic way of dealing with a big issue that's there, right? And for us to bring it down to that level actually then has us adopt the reductive kind of approaches that we're speaking out against, that lends towards these types of notions manifesting themselves in those ways, right? And you just want to bring the best of your brain power and energy to be able to think critically, that then renders real solutions to being able to deal with some of these things.
Hi, Imam. My name is Jonathan, and I'm from a youth movement called Nation Building School. So my question is, I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but I'm just going to ask you anyways. How relevant is religious institution in the 21st century, and how relevant is Islam in today's world?
I mean, I think very clearly Islam is relevant. If it's relevant in a positive way or a negative way, that's a different question. You're talking about 1.5 billion people around the world who Islam is very much so a part of the day-to-day actions that they undertake and decisions. And then when you think about religion on a whole, I mean, much of the world is actually very religiously inclined, and if not religious, at least spiritual. I teach a class at New York University called Multi-Faith Leadership in the 21st Century. It's within the School of Public Service. It's a leadership class. It's not a class that goes into anything dogmatic. We don't talk about like theology and law. We're talking about religion, in terms of its place in society on a whole today. And where we can acknowledge how religion is used potentially as a catalyst for things that are not good. How do we understand religion as a tool for really harnessing benefit, especially in societies that are diverse, and not seeing diversity in and of itself as an achievement, but when we harness that diversity into a much needed pluralism that celebrates and acknowledges the differences that exist, we see that we're moving forward as a society on a whole. And there's challenges that come with everything, right? But I do think that where people's expectations were, that religion would see itself in such a state of declination that it wouldn't exist at a certain point, or the forms that it would exist in wouldn't be what we would have. I think very clearly we see on a global level that that's just not the case. It's not just with Muslims, but you're talking about Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, beyond like the major world religions, or different denominations of those religions, also religions that are not practiced in mass, but not 1.5 billion followers. We're talking about tens of millions of followers. These are like large demographics and populations. People definitely have faith, in that sense. And the challenge, at least where I come from in the United States, is not just the viewpoints of the right, but those who are kind of liberal Democrats who speak quite poorly and see religion in and of itself as being the cause of all problems. I just don't see it as helping in any way, shape, or form. Also, being able to understand, those who call for like certain Reformation movements, those who say that we need to adapt and understand through the frame of modernity. I can't speak to other religions, but Islam has ideas of continuity and change to it. It has those things that are static and those things that are dynamic, but the things that are fixed are in far less number than the things that have the ability to be malleable. Where though, what you're saying ties into what the person said before, the absence of real authoritative structures, or when we take a more culturally hegemonic attitude towards religion, we see an unwillingness at times to be able to say that this isn't a reevaluation or reformation. It's just about really being able to bring Islam into the framework of the context that we find ourselves in today. And so if my scope is about being Pakistani as opposed to being Muslim, I mean, to be Pakistani is inherently to be Muslim because it's a Muslim country, so to speak. But I then don't realize too often how permissibility does not equate to normativity in Islam. So just because it's allowed to be done a certain way doesn't mean that's the only way for it to be done. And so there's just a tendency to hold on to things that don't have to be held on to. And then it resonates in the ways that we see it resonating today. But there's a lot of literature in the States. There's a lot of movement now towards establishing interfaith studies and multi-faith studies as a discipline academically. At our university, we're laying the groundwork and foundation for an actual doctoral program in this as a field. It's very clear religion's not going anywhere. If it's going to be here, we should probably do something well with it. There's 50,000 students at New York University. When we did data analysis to just understand how spiritual and religious life functioned, we found that at this university, where there's a conception that the secularization of universities and higher education in the United States is lending people more towards being disenchanted from religion. At our school, we found that 60 to 70% of student activities were coming in the form of religious activities. And this is in Manhattan, which is a very liberal place. Like, we're not in the south of the United States where, you know, it's the Bible Belt of the country. If you're in Manhattan, there's a lot of interesting things going on the streets in New York City. And these were, you know, documented things. So in Manhattan, space is very hard to find. So people who couldn't find space were then doing religious services just in an empty hallway. You know, they were reading the Bible, you know, in an empty stairwell. They were just finding wherever they could access to this part of their identity. I think that's what we have to start doing. How do we shift the discourse in a way? And you know, what happens in America is that a lot of it's tied to politics. So the Republican conservative movement started to engage evangelical Christians. It changed a lot of the way that people started to understand the relationship between religion and the states in the United States. And it started to be influenced heavily by wealth, right? So, you know, the gun lobby is very much so tied to churches in the United States because it's also like a political issue, right? And like, what does that have to do with Christianity on the faith? Well, it doesn't. It's how religion functions in the world today and how it's being leveraged to be able to, you know, have this kind of impact on society. You see what I mean? So, you know, to answer your question, yeah, I think religion definitely has a place in the world today. I mean, I think Islam is a subset of religion, definitely has a place in the world today. We just have to figure out how to harness it to be, you know, as positive as it can be.
I'm very sorry, but we can only accept one last question.
There's only two left. Maybe you can both just ask it.
Yeah. Maybe both two questions at the same time.
Okay, two good questions. Number one, as an American Muslim, as an American Muslim, you talk about the need to engage with a multicultural society and such. In the recent presidential nominee election, a lot of Muslims voted for Bernie Sanders because of his quite soft stance towards the Palestinians and Israel and such. Yet Bernie Sanders also believes that in equal rights for marriage for same-sex couple. He also believes in pro-choice, in abortion. So how, as a Muslim, your personal faith is actually quite going against with the candidate that you relate most, and how do Muslims with personal faith can engage into politics or civil society in a country that may not cater to all their personal beliefs? And second question, you've talked a lot about Donald Trump and how he's being a radical and such, yet the irony is that I think if Donald Trump, the character of Donald Trump in a Muslim country, would be someone very popular. He would probably rule a Muslim country. In fact, the things that he said about, he's very hawkish on immigration, he's very hawkish on nationalism, he's very much against certain groups, which is similar to a lot of Muslim countries. And it's quite an irony for an American Muslim to actually speak against Donald Trump, yet the examples that shown by Muslim countries like Pakistan, to a certain extent, even Malaysia, Turkey, it's a bit awkward. Does that, and the question that I'm going is that the reason why Donald Trump can be vocally contested in America is that America has this thing called secularism, where you really separate between religion and institutions of democracy. Do you think it will work better in Muslim countries, especially those with multicultural? What's your personal point of view? Thank you.
Yes, one last from the lady on the back.
My name is Reina and I have a question to ask. So, why is it easier for us to listen to people who ask us to fear his punishment rather than convince us about his compassion? Because as in the first verse of Al-Quran himself, which in the name of Allah, He is the entire merciful and especially merciful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the way that the political system works, just to go and answer the order of the questions that were asked, in the States is that no one sees any candidate as being completely in line on every single issue or viewpoint. And there's a little bit more complexity to that. So, and I haven't endorsed any candidate. I work at a nonprofit in the United States, and nonprofits in the United States are not allowed to, in a certain capacity, endorse candidates. That's just by law. Where people look to see how they will support candidates is not to say, here's every reason as to why we disagree, but to look at their overall policy stances, and to then be able to assess, well, based off of who it is that's there, which is the candidate I would actually vote for and support the most. The political system in the United States is really, complex. So the relationship between national government, state government, and city government is one that understands that most of your impact is really going to come from engaging local politics rather than national politics. I mean, half the stuff that Donald Trump is saying he wants to do is stuff that he just wouldn't be able to do, not for any other reason other than the system of checks and balances that exist on the national level wouldn't allow for him to do it. And so, as a Muslim, are you in a place where you can support a candidate who does X, Y, or Z? But I think it's also just thinking about the context that you're in. I don't know how feasible it is for Muslims who live in a non-Muslim country to start to be pro or anti issues that engage the civil rights of other minority populations when so many of our civil rights are infringed upon in the United States every day. And if our motivation is going to be such that we're going to start saying that someone else shouldn't get X, there's going to be that many more people who are going to start to say that we shouldn't get Y. And I'm saying this to you as somebody who has a lot of connections. I've been invited to meet with the president at the White House. I've engaged a lot of different people within the national government, local government, state government. Do a lot of media work. Speak alongside people like the Dalai Lama and Pope Francis. The FBI has visited me in my home multiple times. I get detained, coming off of planes, going into the country that I was born in and I have a passport of. Been profiled, surveilled. I mean, there's a lot of invasive law enforcement policies that takes place. And so Muslims find themselves in a place where day to day their civil rights are not things that really are honored. The way you kind of have impact is to align on certain policy stances and see where it is that you can build coalitions with other populations to empower your voices. And candidates on a whole there's going to be some things that they say that you agree with and other things that you would say that you disagree with. There's a lot of Muslims who aren't necessarily pro same-sex marriage in the United States because of the concept of it. And this is something I haven't really ever thought about or talked about, so I can't tell you where I stand on an issue. But what I would say is that Muslims who would say that people should have access or rights to that or because they don't want to get into the place where they start saying that other people should have their rights denied, because they're just going to see themselves get pushed down that much further. So, you know, I also don't think that the reason why people were supporting Bernie Sanders alone was just because of his stances on international policy, or specifically policy in the Middle East. I mean, he had a lot of things that he was doing that people found a connectivity to, because he was a unique candidate in the frame of just what this two-party system was putting out. And so where Trump came in and offered just a sharp distinction from where candidates really were coming out of the Republican Party, I mean, Sanders essentially embodied a lot of the similarities in terms of how he shook up the Democratic Party, so to speak. The second question you asked, do you remember what the second question was? The second question that you asked, can you just remind me?
The fact that, isn't it ironic?
Oh yeah, I don't know, man. I'm not from a different country, so I really, like, I couldn't tell you. I think where we see, you know, Trump, you know, to me, he's kind of just indicative of the direction the Republican Party is going in. It's turning into a nativist, like, party. And many in the Republican Party see that as beyond problematic, but they have to deal with that as a reality. I mean, his rhetoric is tied not to it being an actual issue in and of itself, but it's symptomatic of a more deeply entrenched racism that the country finds itself dealing with day to day. Are there Muslim countries that have challenges? You know, there are. Are there Muslim countries that don't have those same challenges? They are. I mean, Islam is what Islam is. Like, people are more complex than that, right? You have multiple variables to your identities. So if I only see you based off of, you know, your skin color, your social class, your race, your gender, your religion, there's a tendency for me, when I'm otherizing people, to only see them through one variable of their identity. And then to use that as a justification as to why they do everything that they do. I would almost guarantee that a lot of the people who have led Muslim countries, who have been horrible leaders, were probably not really utilizing Islam as a variable to justify how they treated their communities. Even if when they engaged the media or they built out their platforms, they were saying that's why they did it. They're just horrible people because they're horrible people, right? And they found themselves in a place where authoritatively the structures and systems that were in place left them from being untouched. I don't think that secularization is necessarily what the United States does. The separation of church and state, and what many of the amendments in the Constitution allow for explicitly, is a protection of all religious groups and a freedom of worship. But people are still bringing their religion to the table. I mean, religion plays a deep role in the current presidential election and local politics, because of the way that religious institutions across the board have been able to flourish and be empowered in their flourishment. And many of these candidates cater to Muslims now too, right? For some reason, I have no idea why, but in the last presidential election, I was invited to speak at the Republican National Convention. So some woman called me and she said, "We'd love for you to come and talk." And I was out with my wife buying pillows, and I said, you know, let me take this call. And when she came back, she said, "What happened?" And I said, "This woman wants me to come speak at the Republican National Convention." When I asked her, "Why do you want me to come speak?" she said, "Oh, we're getting all of Mitt Romney's friends together, and it'll be a lot of fun." And I said, "I can't really picture hanging out with a bunch of old white Republicans and doing something like that." And I didn't know that I was a friend of Mitt Romney. There's a lot of interesting things that just learned from this phone call. You know, these parties engage people of minority populations. The Democratic Convention had a ton of Muslims that were speaking at it. And not just people who were like whitewashed, you know, but they had like Dr. Sherman Jackson, who is a really great Muslim American scholar, African American, you know, knows his Islam inside out, and practices it quite authentically. And Muslims are becoming more of a pivotal force in terms of the political arena. And And as much as it's difficult, we're still allowed to practice our faith because of the rights that the Constitution affords to us and other minority populations in the United States. You see what I mean? But I just don't, and I say this, I teach courses on this at our university. I think pointing a finger at religion in specific, individually, is just a scapegoat for us to not really think about deeper entrenched issues and systemic issues that lend towards injustice and oppression, right? Black people are mistreated in my country, not because of the way religion plays a role in society, but it's because people just don't think black people really are important. And it's tied to the foundations of, how otherizing and us versus them mentality actually builds itself up. And how those in the majority are not necessarily conscious of how minority treatment is going to impact them. The United States is going to be in an interesting place because really soon it's going to be a minority-majority country. People are going to have to deal with that as a reality. And you see where people are at, right? The thing with injustice and oppression is that it doesn't just kind of sit. And even if it exists in these small doses, it builds and it builds and it builds, so people aren't going to take it anymore. And that's what you see right now. I mean, a lot of movement and traction around conversations that the country just wasn't having before was because they can't afford to not have it now. And not because they suddenly just want to be nice to people, it's because those minority populations have great clout, they become organized, and they're able to impact the discourse on those levels. You see what I mean? So the last question that was about, I think, just our conceptualization of God. I don't know why people who claim to speak on God's behalf presenting to us in the ways that they do. I mean, when you read Allah's book, you read the Quran, there's a lot that's there about love and mercy and compassion. I think we have a tendency of elevating ourselves by denigrating others. For those of us who practice Islam, there's no sense of anthropomorphizing God in any capacity in Islam as a religion. So when we have verses that speak about the hand of God or the throne of God, that's not what I'm talking about, but more so how we channel our interactions with others to indicate what our relationship with God actually is. So the love that I receive or the absence of love that I receive from people gives me somehow an insight as to what God's love is for me, right? Or where people are in a place where they just leave me behind and they don't think of me, translates to me that, well, God must not be thinking of me. And you don't want to channel human emotion onto the divine, because it becomes limiting, not just of, and it's not because, it's a bad thing to do and, you're going to go to hell if you do that, because that's just the challenge of the construct that we're fighting against, right? People have turned God into a weapon against us. You know what I mean? And the God in Islam is not the way people really present it to be. And that's just not from my personal, you read the Quran, you read the Hadith, we're taught that God, is more merciful to his creation than a mother is to his child. And that's a God that you want to really be able to believe in. I think one of the challenges that exists is in the gap of religious educational institutions, where a lot of the time when people study Islam, it's just through rote memorization, right? So you're studying fiqh, you're studying theology, and it's just about reading books on an abstract level. Most people don't engage people until they're actually in a workplace, right? If you move from the initial traditional learning model that teaches you the fundamentals, you might go on to study iftah, to become a mufti, study case-by-case scenarios. But what other religious traditions have that Islam does not have embedded into its learning system, into its pedagogy, that's what's called pastoral care, right? Where you're able to meet people where they're at. You understand where they're coming from. You can embody real compassion and kindness. And you understand how you can take the text and make it relevant beyond just, what is the answer to a question, right? So how do you teach mercy to a mother whose child died in a drone attack? Or how do you teach forgiveness to a guy who just came out of prison because he was selling drugs to children, or he was involved in prostitution?
right? How do you speak of God's love to somebody who's homeless? And these are real life situations. When we're tied only to books and all we do is regurgitate books, and we don't know how to meet people, it's probably because we're not really ever with people. And it's crazy because when you read the prophetic tradition, people would come to visit the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for the first time from cities far away. They couldn't tell who he was from his people. They would walk around and they would say, "Are you Muhammad? Are you Muhammad?" When they actually met him, then they found distinguishing qualities and whatever, but he was so much of his people that he was literally with them all the time, right? Our leadership, religious, political, whatever, is quite distant from where it is that we're at. And we're not able to then really be in the trenches and understand where people are coming from and how we can connect to them in a very human capacity and human form. And then this channels back to who it is that God is, right? And it's a problem. I had a young man who came to see me, to give you an idea anecdotally of where the issue lies, whose female cousin was walking through her school, and in between classes, so nobody was really out there except her, some guy grabbed her, took her into a stairwell, and raped her. She went back to her Muslim parents and told them what happened. And these people, mashallah, actually heard her. They didn't chastise her or yell at her or scream at her. But they didn't know what to do or where to take her. So they took her to the local mosque. And when they sat down and she told now the religious authority there what happened, so think about this. In a short period of time, she's actually been raped, and she's relived the experience twice now, talking about it to different people. When she tells the person what happened, he says to her, "Well, this is your fault. You don't wear a headscarf, and you go to a school where men and women intermix with each other, so you deserve what happened to you." Aside from the idiocy that's that answer, to really be able to understand what would happen to this young woman. Because this man doesn't represent her, himself to her, but he represents Islam to her. And he's giving her an answer because he's being asked to answer a question that he's just not qualified to answer. And she's now in a place where she believes, well, this is what Islam is saying, and also that she understands, well, that's what God must be thinking of me as a person, or what must God be thinking of me as a person. That's why you have to just be with people. Your presence in certain places is probably a lot more important than you realize, and you don't really understand how much your absence can actually impact people. Think about why there's narrations that say in our tradition, smiling is a sadaqah, it's actual charity. And then smile at people in a way where it's actually something that evokes that as an understanding. Be warm and compassionate and gentle to people. People go through a lot of garbage. And they don't have people to talk to who they can really understand where it is that they're coming from. You just internalize it and keep it all inside. And it leads to a heaviness in a place where you want real light, right? So if you want to understand who God is to you, let's say read the Quran, be reflective and introspective, and let yourself through that reflection assess who it is that God is to you, rather than taking your understanding of your life experiences to dictate a perspective of God. Take a perspective of God and then utilize that to understand and make critical sense of your life experiences. They're two very different things, and we tend to do the former rather than the latter. And I can't speak about people, but if you don't know individuals that you can talk to who give a more empowering discourse on Islam, you can email me. I can send you a ton of people's names, who kind of get it. They understand people are people. They're bigger than the worst of their actions. They're not going to put you into a box. And they'll help you to understand God in a frame that is empowering. It's a choice, right? I would rather choose to worship a God that I believe is actually Rahman and Rahim and Wadud and Latif, as opposed to one that I believe is an angry old man in the sky that is looking for a reason to push me away rather than looking for a reason to bring me close. Thank you all for indulging me and staying here this late. I hope there was some benefit that was derived from this. And again, if I can ever be helpful in anything that you have going on, feel free to reach out. I have Facebook, I use Twitter, you can email me. My contact info is all over the internet, which is really problematic. But we should maintain whatever connections we could. And again, if our time is limited only to this interaction, I pray that God brings us all together again in the best of places in the world beyond this one. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Imam Latif. Maybe any last word from our chairman?
Well, I'd like to invite each one of us that if Imam Latif is okay, let's have a group photo, special session moment with Imam Latif.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, but I'm gonna get Shamil to take that group photo, then he's gonna post it into Aki's Twitter account, then you can just upload it. Download it from the Twitter account, right? So, but after that, selfie or wealthy, whatever is your wish. Okay, let's have the group photo. Oh, I invite you again to, let's give a round of applause to Imam Latif. Yeah, we can just kita for first we're going to be seated dan